Early in the beginning of the space race, the United States and the USSR were deadlocked into the advancement of spacecraft and their launch vehicles. Due to the fledgling technology and lack of resources, early spacecraft were measured in the hundreds, if not dozens of pounds. Even after the success of Sputnik 1, America would launch the Vanguard and Explorer missions, pushing over 30 pounds into orbit and showing that they, the mighty US, could easily pass up the Soviets in time. As we know, with that time, America will eventually have its win, but here, in 1958, the goalpost would move yet again. Sat atop a heavily modified Semyorka ballistic missile, the OKB-1 Design Bureau were preparing an absolute monster. Weighing in at almost 1.5 tons, it was a behemoth, and outfitted with every bleeding-edge technology the Soviet Union could muster. This machine would go on to become the blueprint for the modern scientific satellite. Its name, familiar. It was Sputnik 3. As you probably gathered by now, Sputnik 3 was the third in the line of the famous Sputnik craft. It was launched on May 15th, 1958, launching just 6 months after poor little Laika and Sputnik 2. Sputnik 3 would also have a similar mission in that it was used to test the conditions around low Earth orbit for upcoming manned flights. With previous spacecraft at the time dying within weeks, if not days, Sputnik 3 would be the key for Russia to get vital information on long-term, extended periods in low Earth orbit. It would be dubbed the Orbiting Physics Laboratory, or as the Soviets would call it, Object D, with only us in the West giving it the Sputnik nomenclature. In many ways, and as we will see later, Sputnik 3 was also very much a testbed for the equipment that would later be placed into Luna 3 to gather its images of the dark side of the moon. It would be the first purely scientific satellite in the world, and while it might not be quite on the level of Hubble or the Parker Solar Probe, for its day, Sputnik 3 was the birth of the modern scientific probe as we know it today. Being planned right at the beginning of the space race, it would be none other than Sergei Korolev himself that would suggest the postponing of Object D for a smaller, lighter payload he called the simple satellite, Sputnik. The main reason for this change was the limitations of the R-7 ballistic missile, and while being an incredible achievement in its own right, the original R-7 was made for a nuclear payload, not a large satellite. To launch Object D in over a ton to orbit, the Semyorka would need a little bit of a tune-up, and that's exactly what Korolev and the boys at the OKB-1 Design Bureau would do. I went over the basics of the R7 in my early Luna video, so we'll just go over the differences that happened between the original Sputnik variant to the Object D and Luna variants. As you can see here, it wasn't all too much. Sputnik 3's R7 was a slightly more improved version. It would feature thinner fuel tank baffles, slightly more powerful engines, its telemetry being moved to its nose, and an improved launch trajectory. Unlike the Luna program, it did not feature a third stage, and would use the core stage of the R7 to put it into orbit. These improvements, while increasing performance, would also come at a cost. The first Object D craft was actually launched on April 27th, but due to pogo oscillations that were very misunderstood at the time, the R7 experienced a mechanical failure, exploding 88 seconds into its flight. Because of sensor limitations, and the utter lack of them in critical spots, would also lead to the string of Luna failures, with the Soviets not quite completely solving the pogo issue until later in the R7's life. From what I can tell, it also has this little kicker stage like the Sputnik 2's R7 had, presumably for inducing spin, but not nearly enough to be considered an upper stage like those of Luna or Vostok. It could also just be a fairing or something maybe? I don't know, but it's there. As most of us know, by now, the R7 Semyorka is one of, if not the most iconic and reliable rockets ever made, and it is still being manufactured, taking up missions to the ISS to this very day. Being designed and constructed by none other than Sergey and our boys at the OKB-1 Design Bureau, Object D would weigh in at a massive total of 2,926 pounds, or 1,327 kilograms. Its equipment payload would make up roughly 2,130 pounds of this weight, and was mounted on an internal magnesium alloy frame. It would see it having a height of 11.7 feet, and a width of 5.68 feet. Its outside skin was comprised of polished aluminum, and just like many early Soviet craft, this skin formed a sealed pressure vessel that was filled with nitrogen gas. Just like Sputnik 1, this would also use a, not so tiny this time, fan to circulate and balance internal temperatures, as well as using those cool 16 flappy shutter thingies it's got. It was also one of the first spacecrafts to start using the standardized level of construction that would allow copying of components, a key to early spacecraft success in the days of constant launch failures. As you might be able to tell by the old classic meme here, the old, only one or two terrible existing photos of an early Soviet launch, Sputnik 3 just also happened to be the nose cone of its R7, with its little strongman antennas ready to go as he flies away. So now that we know just how dummy thick Sputnik 3 was, it's time to see what all this bundle of stuff was, and what it all did. As we get into Sputnik 3's devices and details, just remember to subscribe to my channel if you want to see more in-depth reviews on other forgotten spacecraft. Alright, now that we got that shameless plug out of the way, let's see what makes this incredible machine tick. Starting off with the power systems on Object D, there was a lot. I should probably start off with the batteries, because there looks like there was a shit ton on this thing. This thing looks like a battery, this thing looks like a battery, it all looks like a battery. Joking aside, there's not a lot about Sputnik 3's batteries that I could find, other than that they are silver zinc in nature, and that everything I researched said batteries, with an S. The most I could really find was that its main batteries could power its equipment systems for 1 week with some, and up to a month with others. So you know this thing had to be like half battery. Next up is those little solar panels. They were an experimental silicon type and were mainly there to power its groundbreaking scintillation counter and the MAAC transmission system. While I could not find wattage outputs for these panels, we do know that they were also a test as well, having areas being more exposed to gather degradation data via telemetry. Other than assuming it ran primarily on 26 to 28 volts DC like most spacecraft, I wish there was more I could tell you about Sputnik 3's power system, but there's not much. Although, I did find out that solar panels had an efficiency of around 10% via this one single page of an old CIA document. However, there is more detail about Object D's next set of systems, all of those instruments. The instruments on Sputnik 3 were the biggest and largest feature on the craft. Pretty much all of them were highly advanced for the time, especially for being in spacecraft. Up until this time, just about the biggest science instrument sent into space was the Geiger counter sent up by the 30-pound Explorers 1 and 3. Object D would blast past this amount by not only having 2 or 3 instruments, but an incredible 11. Because there is so much stuff on this thing, I will be going over each one and attempt to do a brief description of how they work. If I went into detail on each one, we would be here for hours. Plus, isn't me condensing all of these lame documents and boring reading into a glorified fact sheet the point of this whole thing? I thought so. Let's get into it. First up is a few old classics from the Luna video, the micrometeorite counters and the scintillation counter. In fact, being a technology testbed for the early Luna missions, quite a few of these will sound very familiar to those who have seen that video. Starting with the micrometeorite detectors, they were piezoelectric in nature, and would be made by a woman named, and forgive me here for my terrible Russian, T.N. Nazarova from the Soviet Academy of Sciences. It would consist of a metal plate held up by ammonium phosphate crystals. When a micrometeorite struck the plate, this pressure would compress the crystals, inducing the piezoelectric effect, similar to what happens with an electronic lighter, thus detecting the particle via the voltage output sent out by the crystals. It should be of note that Ms. Nazarova would also make just about all the early micrometeorite detectors in Soviet craft, and her work would be instrumental in proving spacecraft could survive interplanetary space with the future Mars missions. Moving on to the scintillation counter, it sounds crazy, but it's not that difficult to understand. Scintillation is the act of a special material that converts different kinds of radiation into visible light. This counter had such a material, and as with most spacecraft, this would usually output in the ultraviolet spectrum. This would allow a device such as a photomultiplier tube to measure this UV light, and in turn, measure the outside radiation around the craft. After this was done, this signal would have usually been transmitted to the Trial D telemetry system's tape recorder to map the Van Allen radiation belt. But, due to the recorder's failure, it would be up to Luna 3 to later map the belts. Third up, we will kill 2 birds with 1 instrument stone, and that was Sputnik 3's ionization and magnetic manometers. Constructed by yet another female master instrument builder, all of these manometers would be used to measure the vacuum pressures in low Earth orbit and to see just how thin the atmosphere was. Contrary to popular belief, low Earth orbit does indeed have air, albeit in extremely thin amounts. This is the primary reason why such large objects as the International Space Station require frequent orbit boosting, as they are slowed down by this thin bit of atmosphere over time. Getting back to the manometer gauges, Sputnik would have 2 ionization gauges and 1 magnetic gauge on its hull. The 2 ionization gauges would, somehow, measure this vacuum pressure by using a heated tungsten filament to ionize gas and detect pressures. Now that's some proper Soviet mad scientist spacecraft shit if I've ever heard it. The magnetic manometer would be rated for higher vacuums, and, unlike the ionized version, would presumably use an electromagnetic effect instead of the photoelectric effect to gather its readings. Next up on Sputnik is another Luna classic, the Fluxgate Magnetometer. In short, this device would use a difference in the induced electric current between two charged rods to get readings on the Earth's magnetic field. Moving on, we now have the Field Mill Electrometer. This instrument was used for gathering data on the electric field of the craft. This mill would use a DC amplifier to pass current through a rotating shutter to create what's called a chopper circuit. Using this mechanism, and the chopper, the weak DC static charge in the surrounding environment would be converted to an AC signal that could be picked out from the rest of the electrical output, and thusly, the field can be measured. Continuing on, we have the Quadrupole Mass Spectrometer. From what I can gather, and someone correct me if I'm wrong here, this device would use 4 electrically charged metal rods to funnel specific ions onto a detection plate. By differing the electrical power of these rods, this device could be calibrated to select different sized particles to be detected. Over time, this could create an elemental spectrum of low Earth orbit, gathering even more data on top of all the previously mentioned instruments. Now it's time for yet another familiar Luna device, the ion traps. These devices would, trap ions. They would trap these ions using an electromagnetic field, and would be critical for more precise elemental readings. Moving on through, we only got 2 more instruments to go, and those were Sputnik 3's Cherenkov counter and its fluoroscopes. The Cherenkov counter, and yes, it is the same blue light radiation thing at Chernobyl kind of Cherenkov going on here. When radiation, or light, passes through a substance that slows it, it will give off this loss in momentum as visible light. At a basic level, this is the Cherenkov effect. Using this effect, other kinds of radiation can be detected via this visible light, and by none other than our good old friend, the photomultiplier tube. Now for the fluoroscopes. When I was researching this video, I saw this thing and went, what in the hell is a fluoroscope? Turns out, it's really just a fancy scintillation counter that measures low energy electrons, and would also have 2 thicknesses of detectors to get a better range of detection. Many of these instruments were also gimbaled, allowing measurements even as Sputnik 3 tumbles through space. As we get into the remaining systems on Object D, it should be of note that just about every instrument on the craft was made by one single master craftsman or craftswoman. Some, if not many, had small teams, but this is still in drastic contrast to us in the US with our contracts, large teams, and companies. Not to say one was better than the other, both approaches have pros and cons, but I just find the different solutions to the same problems quite fascinating. Anyways, time to talk about what little there is to Sputnik 3's propulsion and navigation. A fair warning here, this section is going to be, a little bit of a joke. Lacking any propulsion, navigation, or stabilization, Object D was a UFO, or Unstabilized Flying Object. These pictures make it look nice, but as Sputnik 3 contained absolutely zero orientation equipment, it was actually tumbling end over end, and every which way as it wanted, as it lumbered its way around the Earth. Because the craft was designed to just spin out of control, Sputnik 3 was mounted with a shit ton of antennas. And I mean a shit ton of antennas. There's an antenna, everyone gets an antenna. See how I segued that? Genius, I know. So, speaking of all those antennas, Object D had 4 main antenna systems, if you wish. The first of these were those strongman arm-looking things that came out of the side of Sputnik. And those were, and forgive me if I butcher this like every other Russian word, it's Trau-D antennas. Trau-D was the main telemetry system for Sputnik 3, and was made from, of course, a modified warhead system. It would run on a frequency of 66 MHz, and these big boy antennas would be what sent out the vast amount of its scientific data. Second were those ones that flipped out from the underside of its hull, and those were the command system antennas. From what I could gather, it would have a total of 6 commands running in pairs on 12 frequencies, and would range from 47.9 to 49 MHz. I could not find what these commands were, but it's safe to say that for 1958, it was still pretty impressive that it had any more than 1 or 2. Another thing that was pretty impressive was the next little bit of communication kit on Sputnik, the radio range antennas. I won't even try pronouncing this one, but nevertheless it sounded pretty cool. Using onboard transponders and operating at the centimeter band, this system could actively send back radar waves for measuring and tracking purposes. Our final, last device to cover on Sputnik 3 was the longest lasting, and from what I can understand, was probably the most impactful. On the very tippy top of its frame was the MAYAC transmitter. Being linked to the main scintillation counter, the MAYAC system would be powered purely based off the solar cell output and would last the entire life of Sputnik 3. It would use an astonishing 1/4 of a watt, and even with its recorder damaged, would still gather a huge amount of radiation data. Both the transmitter, along with all of Sputnik 3, would deorbit and re-enter the atmosphere on April 6, 1960, surviving in a low-power state for around 2 years. So usually at this point in the video, I'd have a special feature of the craft to highlight something cool or crazy about it. However, with just about everything on Sputnik being so goddamn insane, it feels like not one thing on it is more wild than the other. For this reason, I chose to forgo the special features for a fun little fact about Sputnik 3. It should be a great way to conclude and appreciate this craft. Shortly after the original launch failed, Object D No. 1 was still found partially operational after just tanking the explosion and slamming into the ground. Unfortunately, the damage was just a little bit too much, as No. 1 would later short-circuit and actually catch fire, burning it beyond repair. Sputnik 3 might have been the heaviest for its time, but it surely wasn't the first, and with its recorder failure, it wasn't even fully successful. But what it was a groundbreaking machine in a groundbreaking time. While its mission was partially designed to test the R7 ICBM capability, the OKB-1 Bureau didn't design Object D for war. It was made for advancing mankind, and made for science, damn it. The Pioneer, Mariner, and even the James Webb all owe part of their existence to this clunky, tumbling Soviet nose cone, and I think that's hilarious, yet also incredible. Well guys, I think that's a wrap on Sputnik 3. Thank you all for learning with me as we dive into the fascinating world of spacecraft design and forgotten crafts. I have a long list and plenty of stories to tell, so make sure you're subscribed to the channel for more spacecraft documentaries. As always, I'm Ben, this is Retro Rockets, and I hope you have an amazing day.